Okay, good. We've got the recording going, and it is a minute after 7 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. And we're going to be studying chapters 7 and 8 of 2 Samuel. And that'll be the part where God makes a promise to David and of a perpetual kingdom. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right. So like I said, we're looking at chapters 7 and 8 tonight, and in our timeline, it is right between these two dates here sometime. The next, significant thing that happens at this point, in this timeline anyway, would be, something like 8 years after David conquers Jerusalem. So we'll be looking at, and this actually verse or chapter 7 is probably one of the most important ones in all the Bible. And here we are in 7 and 8, a new dynasty and a new boundary. So we're going to be talking about those things. And then we got two more chapters to look at in this part about reigning in Jerusalem, and then we'll be looking at then the kind of the downhill slide of some of David's reign, or some of the rattier parts of it anyway. So but this chapter here, chapter number 7, is important. It's extremely important. Why? Because it is the prophecy. It is a prophecy, one of the best lined out prophecies of the coming Messiah, of Yeshua, and how that his kingdom will be forever. And so this is very important topic for us tonight. All right, so looking at 2 Samuel 7, verse 1, now it came about when the king lived in his palace, and Adonai had granted him rest from all of his enemies around him, that the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See now, I'm living in a house of cedar, yet the ark of God remains within curtains. Go and do all that is in your heart," Nathan said to the king, "for Adonai is with you." All right, so now this word, now, it's just a small little word. Now it came about. Well, I think that what that really kind of means is that we got to think of, okay, God had already given David peace. Now, you'll see that in chapter 8. So this is not exactly chronological, okay? You'll see it in chapter 8 that David had defeated the Philistines and the Edomites and the Moabites and the hypocrites and all those other guys are from everywhere. I mean, it just everywhere he went, the Bible says that David was successful. So this means then that this chapter here came after, chronologically, after chapter 8, which talked about all of the defeats and all the victories that David had and all of his defeated enemies. So the house here it's referred to as his palace, is built out of cedars from Lebanon. You remember the king from Lebanon came down, and they built David a huge palace, as it were, made out of these cedar trees from that are just the cedars of Lebanon. Those were legendary. And so David was looking at this, and he kind of thought, well, maybe I need to, here I'm living in this great palace, and I can see out there God's, the Ark of the Covenant, and what remaining things that we have left from the tabernacle. It's there at it's in a tent. They had a tent over it, and so that's what. In fact, this was the I just for comparison reason comparing things. This would have been kind of the a model of the tabernacle as was built in the Sinai, there in Saudi Arabia at Mount Sinai, and the one that was at then eventually ended up in Shiloh, that was burned then by the Philistines, and so that tabernacle really never was rebuilt as such. They had it had been housed in a person's house somehow, that they brought it into their home, and of course it was definitely a curse on the Philistines when they had the tabernacle, when they had the Ark of the Covenant, and so then when it finally got to Israelite hands, then God blessed it, and they were able to it stayed put and protected in someone's home, and so I just thought, well, here's a picture of what those look like. Of course, here's a detailed look of the holy place here, and where it was this space here, right here, was 15 by 15, just the space for 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet for the Ark of the Covenant, and then this space out here was 30 feet long by 15 feet wide, and then of course 15 feet tall, and that housed the bread of the table of showbread, or the lechem panim, the bread of the faces, and then it also had the incense altar, and of course the menorah, and that was the only furniture that was in that part. Okay, so that is what was there, and how that was all worked out. Okay, then you look at what they call, and I apologize for there's the it's so greatly pixelated, but I couldn't find a picture that I really wanted, that because everything was so stylized, and the paintings and of everything of David's tabernacle was it had some theological biases to it. Okay, so let's just say that. But the David's tabernacle, it was basically just a tent, very very simple thing, not as large as the other. The Ark of the Covenant was in there, along with the incense altar, the table of showbread, and the candlestick, and there was no curtain to curtain off the Ark of the Covenant. So I don't really know how they conducted their business. The only covenant that was curtain was up here, and so basically, people could walk. There wasn't a temple courtyard around it or anything, and so people could actually look right into the end of there, and had some access. So it was a bit different than what the tabernacle that was set up by God at Sinai was. All right, so and so David said, I want to build a temple, and Nathan, his friend and resident prophet, said, well, that sounds like a great idea there, David. Just go for it. And that was more of his own idea, his own thinking, rather than prophecy from God. Okay, so going ahead here, verse 4 says, but it came to pass the same night that the word of Adonai came to Nathan, saying, go tell my servant David, thus says Adonai, are you to build me a house for me to dwell in? Since the day that I brought up the children of Israel from Egypt to this day, I have not dwelt in a house, but have been moving about in a tent, even in a tabernacle. In all my journeying among all the children of Israel, did I ever speak a word to any of the tribes of Israel whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel? Why have you not built me a house of cedar? So um, God rejected David's suggestion that he build a temple for the Lord, and he gave him actually three good reasons. There was, first of all, there's no pressing need for it. I don't need one. Since he said, I've been dwelling in tents all this time, and the tent it was currently occupied. It was the one that David had pitched for him in Jerusalem. I mean, it was there. I mean, so he had a tent. The Ark of the Covenant had a tent. Wasn't the tabernacle that had stood at Shiloh and then at Gibeon, but second of all, God did not command his people to build him a permanent temple. Um, Before God raised up, the kings of Israel's kings, he had himself dealt with the tribes of Israel during the Judges period. Okay, you remember that. At that time, the leaders of all of the tribes were responsible to shepherd the Israelites in their own areas. Each one of the elders and so forth, they kind of were to uh, rule over their own people as tribal entities, and then every once in a while, God would uh, raise up a he would raise up um, a judge or somebody that would throw off the Philistines. So that was the way that God had it planned. And the third reason that he didn't want David to do this was because David was an inappropriate person to build a temple because he had shed so much blood. Now David he had become ritually unclean because of all the killing that he had been responsible for during his long reign. And now that was not true of Solomon. Solomon was not a soldier. Solomon was not a man of blood, as it were. So um, if we look at First Chronicles 17, and then this First Chronicles 15 through 18 kind of parallels where we are at this time in history that we are in the book of Second Samuel. And that same scene is played out where David said, "I'd like to build God a temple," and God in First Chronicles 17, it's much more direct. It's not like David says, "I'd like to build God a temple," and God says, "Are you going to be building me a temple?" That Jewish thing. You have a question, you answer it with a question. So, and this time said God said, "No. Do not build me a temple. You cannot build me a temple." And part of it was I don't think God wanted a temple. He had allowed it to be built, but it's kind of like same reason that he allowed the monarchy. It's just kind of the nature of man at the time in the ancient Near East, Middle East, whatever you call it. The people, they did not really consider a king's sovereignty established until he had built himself an appropriate palace. You got to have a palace. The idea of a shepherd king just wouldn't cut it. The people of the ancient Middle East, they also regarded the kings as the kind of the second in command of the god of that country. Each people group or each country had their own gods, and so you remember that if one country or people group defeated another people group, that was because their god was greater than the other gods, and so then they would capture the defeated gods and parade them around saying, "Our god's bigger than your god," that sort of thing. And that's why they had the Ark of the Covenant. They carried that. That's the symbol of the Jewish God, and so they carried it around, saying, "See, our God was bigger. Dagon was bigger than the Israelite gods," and so Of course, that didn't end well for them, because everywhere that they went, that they put the Ark of the Covenant there in the Philistine towns, the town broke out with plague, and so that's when they decided, you know what, this is not good. Let's give it back to the Israelites, and maybe if they get the plague, we don't care. So um, they viewed these temples as the god of the gods. That you had to have a temple. They viewed that as the palace of the true king. So that if in the mind of David, maybe he thought that it was inappropriate for him, actually, as the second in command of Israel, because he lived in a big palace, but God lived out back in a tent. And so he just didn't think that was right. And so, the Canaanites often built big palaces to their gods. In fact, the Philistines had a huge palace for Dagon. That that was their big palace. So but Nathan, he says, well, yeah, go for it. But he didn't do that, like I said, as a prophet of God. It was not one of these things that, thus says the Lord, you can do this. No, he says, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, that night God told him, Nathan, no, we don't want to do that. So any comments or questions so far while I get a drink? Okay. In verse 8 it says, so now thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Adonai Tzvaot, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make your name as great as the greatest on earth. I will also set up a palace for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place. I will set up a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as in the past, since the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. So I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, Adonai declares to you that Adonai will make a house for you. All right. Looking at this right at the last, well, all throughout this, it says that I will make a place for Israel, of course, for my people. And there you go. God had given them the land of Israel. All right. And let's go back to where we are here in where God is vetoing David's plan. But now he says, I will, he's going to build David's dynasty. Now he says, you're going to have rest. You're not going to have, you're not going to be disturbed again. Does that mean that they weren't going to have any little incursions from neighboring countries? No, just that not to the extent that they had before, where they were where it was an existential threat to them, that if they didn't beat the Philistines, they might not be around the next day. They might not live to fight again. They had to defeat the Philistines or whoever was against them. So the house then that where he says, I will make you a house, this house that the Lord is promising to David here really has no reference to it's not talking about a physical place. It was not talking about real estate, and or any kind of a physical residence. It was a promise that God would establish David's dynasty as a ruling family in Israel, and that God would give David a great name among all the distinguished rulers over the kingdoms of men. And it's an indisputable fact that God did exactly what he here promised to do for David. I mean, David is the quintessential king of Israel. If you talk about the kings of Israel, who do you talk about? You talk about David. You don't talk about Saul or Rehoboam or Jeroboam or any of the other ones so much. The first thing you think of is King David. And so that's what he's talking about here. I'm going to build you a dynasty for you, for your family. So going on, when your days are done and you sleep with your fathers, I will raise up your seed who will come forth from you after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. If he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and with the strokes from sons of men. Yet my loving kindness will not be withdrawn from him as I withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Um, so your house and your kingship will be secure forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. Just so Nathan spoke all these words and all this vision to David. All right, this here, these few verses that I just read there, is the most important part of this um, chapter 7. This is the messianic prophecy. All right. Now, a lot of there are scholars that they want to look at this passage and say that it applies to Solomon. That all of this applies to Solomon, but it really can't be, because the prophecy says that after David dies, after you sleep with your fathers, that means, okay, after you're dead and gone, then I will raise up a son from you, meaning one of your descendants. At this point, Solomon was already, he had already been born, so it couldn't be Solomon because David was alive, Solomon was alive, and we have this problem, though, when it comes to verse 14. It says, if he commits iniquity, and of course, Yeshua never committed a sin. Now, Adam Clarke, one of the truly great scholars, for the last couple of centuries, and I refer to some of his comments quite often in preparing all this stuff. He gave this translation for it, and it makes a lot of sense. It says, rather than if he commits iniquity, his translation, or looked at it, was even in his suffering for iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the rod due to men, with the stripes due to the children of men. All right. There's another one that just says that if he commits iniquity, which of course he didn't, or if he would ever commit iniquity, or if he would ever commit iniquity, then I would chasten him. Well, it was never necessary because Yeshua never committed any sin, so it would have never been necessary for God to chasten him with the rod and of men. Okay, so but Isaiah referred to this later on. You all are familiar with it, 53:5, where he says, but he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our shalom, our peace, was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. So that's kind of what plays into that prophecy there, what we're talking about. Verse 16 says the throne will be forever, and that probably David and Solomon both interpreted that incorrectly, and because they're thinking more of the physical aspect right then, and who can blame them for that? But today, we have the benefit of 3,000 years later, knowing that what this prophecy was about the Messiah, Yeshua, rather than a physical participant on the throne of David. And the Apostle Peter tells us that David says concerning the Messiah that if you will, and this goes back into throws back into the King James version. If thou wilt you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor let your Holy One see corruption. And so that's in Psalm 16:10. David, he was at this point being a prophet. He's prophesying and said he knew that God had sworn an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on the throne. So he foresaw and he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah. And, we know that he was not abandoned to Hades, and his flesh did not see corruption, because again, he was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, and under Jewish tradition, that the corruption starts on the fourth day. And so Acts 2, 25 to 31 also talks about that he did not his body did not see corruption. All right, so this passage here in 2 Samuel 7, it refers to Yeshua, the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, as the one who would sit on David's throne, not to Solomon. Now, we can also get into dispensationalism and other things about, okay, well, when is this throne? Because there are some that say, well, that Yeshua is on the throne right now because it sits on the right hand of the Father, and this was a what you would call more of a theological setting. And I almost said the word spiritual, but in our yeshiva, Rabbi Bernstein always jumps on you if you say spiritual. And so I try not to use that word anytime, because he'll say, well, what do you mean by spiritual? Define spiritual for me. And then when you start doing that, he gets onto you. And so just trying to push you into saying something like, okay, yeah, this is outside of time and space. And so what are we talking about? A physical aspect of of an everlasting kingship, or are we talking about more of a theological aspect? I think there's both, because eventually Yeshua is coming back to this earth, and he will reign for 1,000 years in the millennium, and then after that, then he will reign forever. And earth was created for man, so Yeshua will be reigning from the New Jerusalem, which will be on the new earth. There will be a new heaven, a new earth, and oh boy, that's a rabbi trail for you. Okay, that we could go down, but I need to stay here and get through this. Verse 18 said, then King David went in and sat before Adonai and said, who am I, my Lord Adonai, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? Yet this was a small thing in your eyes, my Lord Adonai, for you have spoken also of your servant's house for the distant future. This is a revelation for humanity, my Lord Adonai. What more can David add in speaking to you? For you already know your servant, my Lord Adonai. For the sake of your word and according to your own heart, you have done everything great, revealing this to your servant. Therefore, you are great, my Lord Adonai, for there is none like you, and there is no other God beside you, as we all have heard with our ears. What one nation on earth is like your people, like Israel, whom God went to redeem for himself as a people, to make for himself a name, to do for you a great thing and awesome deeds for your land, before your people whom you redeemed for yourself from Egypt, driving out nations and their gods. And he goes on, so you establish for yourself your people Israel as your very own people forever, and you, Adonai, have become their God. So now, my Lord Adonai, confirm the word that you have spoken concerning your servant and his house forever. And do as you have promised. Let your name be magnified forever by saying, Adonai Tzvaot is God over Israel. May the house of your servant David be established before you. For you, Adonai Tzvaot, God of Israel, have made a revelation to your servant, saying, I will build you a house. Therefore your servant has found in his heart to pray this prayer to you. So now, my Lord Adonai, you alone are God, and your words are truth, and you have promised your servant this good thing. So now let it please you to bless the house of your servant, to continue forever before you. For you, my Lord Adonai, have spoken, and with your blessing, your servant's house will be blessed forever. Okay, so that's David's prayer. And when you read through it, okay, it's just an observation. A lot of times when people pray, I notice that it's it's kind of like a um, I don't know. It's something of a of like when we're speaking Spanish or something like that, and you don't really know what to say. Certain cultures in Spanish they'll use the word este, or in English we'll say you know, and it's he was like this, or he was, it was their expressions. And so when people pray, a lot of times they will use some aspect of God's name, and it's Father God. That's the one that always uh, gets my attention when people are praying, and every other word seems like when they don't know what it is that they're going to say the next time when they're praying, it's Father God, and so looks like David is doing some of that here, where he says, my Lord Adonai says it, almost every verse. And so just that's okay. That's just a rabbi trail. Okay, just an observation. So David was looking at this prophecy as a promise of a physical kingdom lasting forever. And actually, really and truly, there's no way that David could possibly have known, absent some kind of a divine revelation, which doesn't look like he had, that he would understood that the perpetuity of his throne would be guaranteed by the Son of God, rather than just the physical means of he was going to have a son on that throne for generation after generation after generation. Very, very few monarchies in this world have lasted uh, more than a few hundred years in direct lineage of because even you look at the British throne, that that is not a direct line um, from this one or that one or the other. It was because it was a lot of times it was whoever was best with the sword that was still somehow in the family, and maybe not, sometimes not even in the family. And so um, it just doesn't happen in the physical. So, and that's where we get now to chapter 8. Now, are there, before we go on, any comments or questions or observations on this Davidic covenant? Because I think we had yeah, these are the things that I wanted to bring out before we go on to chapter 8, the Davidic covenant, as it's called, that promises in David's lifetime. Now, he would have what? He would have a great name. We know that. He would have a place for the people, meaning Israel, and they would have rest. Okay, they are now David, into his kingship here quite a few years. He's already whipped everybody around him, and they settled things down, and so they're having rest. Then there's the other part of the Davidic covenant that talks about, okay, after David after he's dead and gone, he has, he's gone away to sleep with the fathers. Um, that his house would be fulfilled, meaning that his dynasty would continue, and that he would have a seed or a descendant then that would establish a kingdom that would be forever. And so this was, of course, then through the kingship, the lineage of David. What I've written down here, got down here, is a full accounting of based on the book of Matthew and also based on the book of Luke, that has the full lineage from Solomon um, down to Joseph, okay, through the father's line, okay, that's the Davidic line. But then we also have through Luke, and there again, that is another Davidic line, but it's through the mother, and so that it gets back down now to where it has Miriam, and that is a study all in itself to try to figure out all of these particular names and who they are. A lot of them, have been lost to history. We don't have a story of them. All we know that it's written down in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke that these were people who were the direct descendants of David. And so therefore, when Yeshua then comes on the line, legally, Joseph was the father of Yeshua, but in a sense, a legal sense, of course, we know that in a physical sense he was not, because God caused Miriam to conceive, not Joseph. But in the eyes of the world, Yeshua was the son of Joseph. In fact, they even said, at times, this is, isn't this Joseph's son? And here he is spouting off stuff about the Torah that is just unbelievably deep and profound. And how could this be that, a mere craftsman's son, a tradesman's son, could be such a Torah scholar, having not been taught and so forth. So they considered him a son of Joseph, and then of course through the mother. And so anyway, that's those are some of the things that I wanted to bring out about that Davidic covenant. Are there any comments or questions then on the Davidic covenant before we go on? I mean, we could spend. I could have spent hours just talking about the Davidic covenant and what all, getting really down into the weeds on it. But I think that pretty well tells it that God was giving David a promise of a future, that his kingdom was going to last forever. But we know now that it wasn't a physical kingdom; it was a kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, as it were. All right, going on to chapter 8. Now, the major things that happens with chapter 8 just talks about that David defeated the Philistines, and then he defeated people at all the way up to the Euphrates. He was able to battle with folks all the way up there, and so his territory extended all the way up, past Damascus, and all the way up to the Euphrates River, which was also part of what God had said was the boundaries that that Israel should have. Went all the way to the Euphrates, and then went back down to the river of Egypt, which we know is not the the Nile River, but a river that everyone in the Middle East referred to. It was a Wadi something, I can't remember right off the top of my head, but it is, pretty much the southern border of Israel today, from Eilat back up to the Mediterranean, and it pretty well follows where that uh, river or tributary then uh, went from the higher elevations down into the Mediterranean. So then David's territory extended down to the south, and that's what we're talking about now. And then he defeated Edom, and then they have a list of David's principal officials. So during the 40-year reign of David, he founded basically the empire of Israel, which ran from Dan. They don't even have it up here, but it's up there at the top, all the way down. In fact, this is not a real. These are the southern conquests of David, and I've got another map here in just a second. But they went from Dan to Beersheba, and then so here is this right along here is where that river of Egypt went, and kind of follows now where Eilat is. Not exactly, but it's close. All of the old enemies of Israel were defeated and were made tributary to the king. In fact, they had to pay taxes and so forth to the king of Israel. And they set up strong military garrisons on strategic locations throughout all of Israel. And so here's here's a picture of those areas, and you see here the brook of Egypt, or the river of Egypt, is down here, and you see that here. All right, and so then David's kingdom went well on up to the Euphrates River there. So this is not a chronological report of David's victorious wars. Military operations of all parts of David's reign were included, and they were not in any particular specific order, by their occurrence or something like that. So there's a lot of questions that come up against comparing this with Chronicles 18, First Chronicles 18, but for the most part, it's not really significant to us today as believers. There's difference of names and people and of the places and the people that were in charge and so forth. But names, places, they have different names all the time, from that we look at in the Bible, and it says this one place has this name, but then another place in the Bible it talks about, no, it has this name. Well, that's really nothing unusual. I mean, there's a place here in Texas that it's gone by three names. That one name of it on the railroad station, when they had the railroad going through, was called Jake Hammond. That's the railway stop. But the post office is called Desdemona. And then during the oil boom, the Roughnecks for 100 miles around, they used to call it Hogtown, and we'll just leave it at that. Why they called it Hogtown, okay? But the place is known by all three of those designations, and so let's see, one of the places that right down here at the Gat. Okay, now that was, if you remember, the Philistines, man, they had covered in a lot of this area up here. I mean, they really taken over a lot of Israel, and so David drove them back in this city of Methagama, yeah. That has pretty much they've figured out that that is the city of Gath here, and you remember that's where the king that David, he was working for, was there in Gath, and he had given him that a place down further in the Philistine territory, and that was the king that he was going to go up with against Saul. And the king said, "Nope, nope, nope. None of my generals want you with them. So you going back home." And so that's when David did. But that's where that was. So David actually took over that. He drove the Philistines back to basically what is still today known as the Gaza Strip. I mean, it's amazing how um, how that um, some of this historical stuff, just follows right back to today's headlines. Yeah, and we're not going to call it Chaz or whatever, or whatever that silliness is going on up there in Seattle. So David defeated Moab over here and killed off 2/3 of the army. And it would not have been out of character for actually it wouldn't have been out of character for David or any other Middle Eastern potentate, general, or whatever, to, when you go up against an army, you left no survivors. And in fact, that's what God told Joshua several times: is no survivors, no quarter, because they had a chance to leave and get out and go away. They wouldn't do it. They're evil. They're under judgment. So that is the judgment. They are all to be executed. And so David then, rather than execute all of them, he executed 2/3 of them, of the army, and then extracted tribute from the rest of the country. All right. So, and we don't know why, you could look at it once, say, well, why did he do such a terrible thing? Just line everybody up on a line and said, okay, everybody count off 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay. All of you threes, you get to go home. All of you number ones and twos, you're going to be executed. So why did he do that? Well, some of the Jewish writers, and I couldn't find it in the Bible when I was looking for it, but some of the Jewish writers say that David's family was killed in Moab when they were supposed to be under the protection of the king of Moab, and his father and family were killed there. And so David was doing this in retribution. I could not find a biblical reference for that. It was it's one of the Jewish writers, the Chazal, says that. All right. So, but you can say at the other side of it is, well, he could have killed them all, but he only killed 2/3 of them, let 1/3 of them go. Why was that? Well, maybe because grandma was from Moab. Remember his grandmother was this lady called Ruth. All right. And so that's why, maybe he was being a little bit kinder on that. All right. So David, he also defeated King Hadad-ezer, son of Rehob Zobah, and so there, he went to restore his dominion along the river. All right. So that could be up, actually, what that is the Euphrates rivers, where he's talking about the Arameans. And he captured 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung all the chariot horses while reserving 100 of them for chariots. When the Arameans of Damascus came to the aid of King Hadad-ezer of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of the Aramean men. Then David stationed garrisons in Aram of Damascus and the Arameans became vassals to David, paying tribute. So Adonai gave tribute to David wherever he went, and gave victory to David wherever he went. David also took the golden shields of Hadadezer's officers and brought them to Jerusalem. From Betah to Berothai, towns of Hadadezer, King David took a vast amount of bronze. Okay, by defeating this king Hadadezer, David expanded his influence all the way up to the Euphrates River. And okay, so if what he did next is to be properly or correctly understood, to go in and hamstring all of these horses, that's a horrible thing to do, especially if you're a horse lover, and so to just go ahead and permanently cripple the horses so that then they couldn't be used for anything. They would always have a lame foot, and so that was I don't know why he actually did that. It doesn't say, but he kept 100 horses, and actually that was sort of against what God had told David, any king to do. Says, don't keep for yourself many horses. And we know that Solomon had thousands of horses and chariots and so forth. Even I've been to one of Solomon's stables and seen where they still had the mangers, or the food troughs where they had the horses. And we know that it was horses and stuff that they kept there because they'd gone in and excavated the ground, and even after 3,000 years excavated the ground, they found out that in that stable that they found the minerals and so forth consistent with urine and manure from horses, even that if you go outside of that stable, or out of just a few hundred yards away, you don't have that sort of thing. So we know that that was a stable, and from other things that it was during Solomon's time. So anyway, a little tidbit that I didn't write in my notes. All right, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. This is, I think, this is the thought that dominates this entire chapter. That it was not the superior military ability of David, although he was a good soldier and so forth, nor the overwhelming size of his armies, because he didn't have an overwhelming army, nor his strategic genius that resulted in these victories. They were the doings of the Lord. The Lord handed them over, and I think David recognized that. So God's purpose and all of this power being conveyed over to the chosen people should not be overlooked. And the plans designed for the eternal purpose of God, that the preservation and the continuity of the people of Israel, through whom the Messiah was going to be, is necessary. They had to be alive and functioning and vital for the Messiah then to be born through the lineage of David. And so they had to be a strong military outfit to keep from being totally overrun. And so they would have eventually, if they hadn't done that, they would have been swallowed up by the Assyrians. So going ahead then with this is now, when King Toi of Hamath heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Toi sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer. For Hadadezer had been at war with Toi. Joram brought him articles of silver, gold, and bronze. These too David consecrated to Adonai, along with the silver and gold that he had consecrated from all the nations that he had subdued. from Aram, Moab, Ammonites, Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. So Toi, this guy, he was a he had been at battle and war with this Hadadezer for a long time, and so when David defeated him, then what he didn't have to fight the Hamath, this king of Hamath. His name was Toi. Because he had readily consented to go ahead and pay tribute to David out of gratitude for David's defeat of their traditional enemy, Hadadezer. So, David defeated his enemy. He says, "Hey, look, we're already paying some tribute. We'll just give it to you. Just, let us live in peace, and we can all get along." And so that's what David did. And so he dedicated the spoils of war to the temple building fund. All right. And so you can I like to think of it as, back in the day when they had, when I was growing up, and churches would have their building fund, and you'd have this big thermometer thing, with the, as they got closer and closer to their goal, the thermometer would rise up and so forth. I think all of you have seen those kind of things, but that's kind of what I think of David, putting all this stuff, stocking it up for his son Solomon to build. So David made a name for himself when he returned from striking 18,000 down from Edom in the Valley of Salt. Of course, now Edom down here is that is pretty. That's down by the Dead Sea, and it's just dry, desolate area. Now, how it was 3,000 years ago, I don't know, but I know today it's very, very dry and foreboding. You just can't. Nobody hardly lives there till you get down here to Eilat. And so just basically everywhere David went, he was victorious. God gave him the victory. And so then the chapter finishes out with a list of David's ministers, his officials. And Joab, we already know, was the commander over the army, and evidently the role of recorder or historian was pretty important, because they actually listed here a guy named Jehoshaphat, and Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were Kohanim. That means they were both of them high priests. One of them appointed by David, and the other appointed by Saul. And so again, the recorder, the scribe, was very important, and they were Sariah was the scribe. And David somehow skillfully managed this until one of them died, and they would have just one high priest. Then it said Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. Now, in some of the translations, they talk about that David's sons were priests. Well, only it would only be in the sense that they were. I think this is a better translation. They were ministers. They were officials. That's like today. We will talk about someone in certain countries that he's the minister of defense. Well, we have a word that we use for minister, that's a guy who's the head of a church. Well, it's kind of the same thing. They use the word priest in this case for David's sons being chief ministers. So anyway, that closes out the 2 chapters, And so again, chapter 7, very, very, very important because it points to the coming Messiah. And now, next week, we will not have class next week. I will send you a reminder. But I got an SOS call from my youngest son today, and he needs me to go up there and help him general contract or actually what he needs me to do is bring up some of my tools and help him get his house finished out so that he can move into it. And so we'll be going up there for 4 or 5 days and helping him do that. And so I won't be able to have the class next week, but then we will be back on the 28th of June with class there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we will just, if you had any question. First, are there any questions before we stop the recording? Any questions or comments that you'd like to make?
Thank you for the teaching.
Well, you're welcome, Jorge. Hope you didn't get too hot. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Good, good. So I'm just going to say Shavua Tov, have a good week, and we'll see you next time.